Not every serial killer waits in the shadows. Some wear scrubs, some carry syringes, some walk straight through the ICU, smiling. These 5 didn't break into hospitals. They worked there. They timed the murders between shift changes. They signed the death charts themselves, and nobody questioned it, not until the bodies started piling up. Before I show you how they suffocated, poisoned, and drained their victims under the guise of care, drop your city and time in the comments, and please subscribe the channel to hear more serial killers' disturbing stories again. These killers didn't need masks, because trust was already their weapon. He came highly recommended, always did. Dr. Warren Clyde wasn't just respected inside the walls of St. Carlotta Medical in suburban Illinois. He was revered. His credentials ran 4 pages long. He'd once volunteered with international relief teams. He'd published 3 academic papers on cardiac anomalies. He mentored interns, brought coffee to overnight nurses, and walked the late-night halls like a man who'd given up sleep for the sake of service. But beneath the charm, the bow tie, and the vintage leather briefcase he always carried, there was something nobody ever questioned. Why, in all his years, none of his patients ever got better. Cardiology was his specialty, but his real obsession was with endings, quiet, clinical endings that didn't set off alarms. It started with one patient, a woman in her early 50s, recovering well after a minor myocardial infarction. Her vitals were stable, her spirits high, and her daughter had just left for the night with a balloon and a half-eaten salad in hand. 4 hours later, her heart stopped. No code blue, no warning, just flatline. Dr. Clyde was the one who signed the death certificate. "Unexpected ventricular failure," he wrote. "No autopsy requested, no suspicion." But the pattern began to build. Patients in rooms closest to his overnight station died quietly, often between 2 and 3 a.m. All had improved vitals hours before. None had cardiac events severe enough to justify sudden arrest. The hospital had no idea they were harboring a serial killer in a white coat. Warren Clyde's method was both terrifyingly simple and ruthlessly effective. He introduced a custom compound into patients' IV bags, a blend of potassium chloride and trace beta blockers. The potassium would cause rapid cardiac arrest if administered swiftly, but Clyde understood pacing. He diluted it perfectly, allowing the heart to slow over an hour, then stop altogether without triggering alert thresholds. Nurses didn't notice, machines didn't beep. Death came disguised as sleep. What made him nearly invisible was his paperwork. He was meticulous. He backdated log entries to make it seem like vitals were trending poorly. He'd even switch ECG paper strips with older ones from other patients, slipping the real ones into his briefcase, the one he never let anyone else open. But Clyde didn't kill for mercy. He wasn't ending suffering. He was collecting. Each file was labeled and stored in a secret compartment in his home, paired with patient wristbands, vial caps, and even slivers of hair sealed in laminated sheets. It was only after the 12th death in 6 months, all under his supervision, that a quiet nurse named Lena started noticing. She kept her suspicions silent but began keeping her own log. And one night, as she passed by room 413, she noticed Dr. Clyde bent over a patient's IV, syringe in hand, not charting, not adjusting dosage, but inserting something. She didn't confront him. She simply made a call. What followed was a silent investigation, aided by hospital admin and law enforcement. Cameras were installed without staff knowledge. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, in room 506, they caught him. Syringe in hand, IV port open, and his eyes locked on the monitor as the patient's heart rate slowed by the second. He didn't flinch when they entered. He simply stood, placed the cap on the needle, and whispered. He wouldn't have made it. But the patient did make it, because the IV bag had been switched. The syringe filled with saline. They had no footage of actual killings, only this attempted one, not enough to arrest. until they searched his home. The house was too perfect. A white brick colonial with ivy-wrapped columns, a trimmed lawn, and a sign above the mantel that read, "In healing we serve." But when investigators stepped into the study, the illusion peeled back. Hidden behind a false drawer in the mahogany desk, they found what Dr. Clyde had been building for over a decade, a personal archive of death. Dozens of manila folders, each tagged with initials and dates, stacked like trophies. Inside, every file held full patient histories, stolen or copied, alongside autopsy-free death reports, printouts of vitals, and something worse, a sealed envelope containing a relic, a dried, blood-soaked gauze, a photo of a hand with IV bruising, a medication label peeled from a now-missing vial. One folder, marked simply with the letter E, included a child's hospital bracelet and a note that read, "Too soon, but necessary." No such patient ever existed in the hospital's system. Authorities also discovered the briefcase he always carried, but it didn't contain charts or pens. It held vials, unlabeled, custom-filled. 8 of them matched the exact chemical fingerprint found in post-mortem blood samples from 5 of his patients. The compound, though never administered in fatal doses on camera, was now traceable. That gave them grounds to exhume bodies. Of the first 3 they checked, 2 showed definitive evidence of slow potassium poisoning. It was enough to indict. During questioning, Clyde remained disturbingly composed. He never denied the killings, but he never called them murders. "It was balance," he said. "Some hearts don't deserve to beat longer than others. I just helped time along." Prosecutors argued that Clyde had an obsessive need for control, not over life, but death. That in the sterile stillness of hospital rooms, he found a godlike power no one suspected. He was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. But the final twist came from the folders found in a separate fireproof safe in his garage, labeled only with future dates. Each had a name, a hospital wing, a full patient plan, all never enacted. He had been planning his next set of victims, not terminal patients but stable ones, happy ones, people who had just been told they were going home. He wanted the shock, the interruption, the power of snatching back hope. And before he was caught, the next patient on his list had already been admitted for a routine heart check. That woman lived because a nurse paid attention, but others wouldn't be so lucky in other hospitals. Warren Clyde turned medicine into murder with nothing but gloves, forms, and routine. But he wasn't alone. In a different wing, under a softer voice and brighter smile, another walked the halls. Evelyn Mercer, a nurse, a comfort, and a quiet collector of lives no one would miss. Nurse Evelyn Mercer was not the kind of woman people feared. At St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, she was called Angel Evelyn by patients and co-workers alike. She wore soft pink scrubs, kept peppermint candies in her pocket for nervous patients, and hummed hymns while adjusting IV lines. She had a calmness that made people feel safe, a stillness that made her seem almost holy. But behind that calm smile was something else entirely. Evelyn wasn't just kind. She was calculating, and she didn't just comfort the dying. She chose them. Evelyn had worked the night shift for nearly 7 years in the palliative care wing. She preferred the dark hours, fewer supervisors, fewer questions, and most importantly, fewer witnesses. Her victims weren't random. They were carefully selected among the terminal, the forgotten, and the nearly invisible. She watched for patterns. Patients with no visitors, families who hadn't paid their bills, charts marked "Do not resuscitate." To most, these meant easing suffering. To Evelyn, they meant freedom. Freedom to end a life without being questioned. Her method was slow and quiet. She would adjust morphine doses just slightly above the limit, enough to blur the cause of death between disease and overdose. She logged it all carefully in the chart, masking the numbers under late-night code entries that were never double-checked. Her preferred weapon was not a syringe, but a setting on the IV pump she could manually override. The machines beeped less that way. No alarms, no red flags, just silence. Her shift routine never changed. First, she made her rounds, checking on the difficult patients first, those who moaned or cried or tried to get up too often. Then she moved to the quiet ones, the ones who didn't speak, who stared at the ceiling, waiting to die. It was in their rooms she spent the most time. She would speak to them gently, telling them they weren't alone. She'd brush their hair, adjust their blankets, and all the while, her hand would linger just a little too long on the morphine button. One nurse reported that Evelyn always carried her own gloves, never using the standard supply. Another said she saw Evelyn tear up a note once from a patient who had written, "She did it," on a napkin, but no one followed up. After all, the patient was delirious and barely coherent. That patient died 2 hours later, and the napkin went into the biohazard bin. For years, Evelyn moved unnoticed, racking up deaths that no one tracked. It wasn't until a new intern, just weeks into rotation, noticed something strange that anyone raised a flag. He was doing a late-night audit on patient records and noticed several patients in the same wing, same room number, had all died within the same month, year after year. Different names, different conditions, same result. He flagged it to his supervisor, who dismissed it as coincidence. But the intern dug deeper. He pulled physical records from the basement archive, discovering that most of the patients who died in room 312 had been under Nurse Evelyn's care, not just once or twice, but consistently for 5 years. He shared the findings with a friend in IT who traced access logs for that room's digital file. Evelyn had accessed the logs more than anyone else, even more than the attending physicians. The intern tried to raise concerns again, but this time, HR got involved and told him to stop making accusations without evidence. A week later, that intern got reassigned to another department. And Evelyn? She stayed right where she was. What nobody knew was that Evelyn kept a private book at home, locked in a drawer beside her Bible. In it were lists, names, dates, final words. Each page was marked with a small red heart in the top corner, as if she were tracking kindness, not death. She called it her mercy ledger. To her, what she did wasn't murder, it was relief. She wrote about each victim with strange affection, noting which ones looked at peace and which ones fought it too long. Some pages had poems, others had pressed flowers from the hospital gift shop taped inside. It was all perfectly neat, as if she were preparing a scrapbook instead of documenting serial killings. Then, one night, everything changed. A patient named Harold Kinney was admitted with terminal liver failure. He was quiet but alert, a retired lawyer with no family. Evelyn saw him as the perfect target. No visitors, no code status, fading fast. But Harold was sharper than he looked. He noticed that after Evelyn's visits, his IV pump settings were slightly off. He began scribbling notes on the back of his meal slips. One night, he hid his phone under the pillow and recorded her during her midnight round. The next morning, he asked to speak to the hospital administrator, but died before the meeting took place. His body was cremated that afternoon per pre-signed forms, but his belongings, including the phone, were stored in the hospital's lost property. Weeks later, his niece came to claim them. She listened to the recording. It was quiet, but clear enough to hear Evelyn humming, followed by the soft click of an IV setting being changed. She turned it over to police. An investigation began discreetly. Hospital staff were questioned. Access logs were reviewed. A forensic audit was done on the IV machines. Patterns emerged. Evelyn's override code had been used on machines connected to patients who died unexpectedly, always during her shifts, always within minutes of her last entry. When confronted, Evelyn smiled. She didn't run, she didn't deny. She simply said, I gave them peace. The case became national news, but what horrified investigators most was that many of her victims might never be identified because their deaths were expected. She hadn't just used medicine to kill, she had used the entire hospital system as a shield. Her kindness had been her disguise, her silence had been her weapon. And when detectives opened her mercy ledger, they realized how far back it went. Over 60 names, some with dates, some with drawings, some simply marked ready. But the final page had only one word, written in perfect cursive: me. Evelyn had planned to end her own life once the ledger was full. But she never got the chance. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In prison, she worked in the infirmary, and some say the deaths there began to rise too, but no proof was ever found. What's terrifying is that Evelyn was never angry, never cruel. She believed she was helping. That's what made her so dangerous. And the person who replaced her in the palliative wing discovered something strange beneath the cushion of the chair she used most. A tiny paper heart with the word soon written in red ink. But Evelyn was already gone. The only question that remained was whether she had ever truly felt guilt, or if she just considered herself the final dose in a treatment plan no one asked for. Evelyn Mercer's shift reports were spotless, her uniform always crisp, and her voice so soft it could lull even the most anxious patient into quiet compliance. That's how she got away with it for as long as she did. Her victims weren't random. They were chosen by absence, the ones without family, without visitors, without hope. She kept a little notebook tucked inside her locker, marked with small symbols instead of names. A triangle meant diabetic, a square meant immobile, a circle meant terminal. If two of those appeared beside a name, Evelyn watched. If all three did, Evelyn waited. She called it weeding. The way she saw it, hospitals were overgrown gardens, and her job was to prune what couldn't be saved. It started slowly, a slight shift in dosage, an insulin push that dipped just low enough. Morphine drips extended just minutes past safety. No one questioned it. The patients were already dying, and Evelyn was there, always first to press the code blue button when the monitor flatlined. She cried during the deaths. She hugged the night staff. She wrote long, beautiful condolence notes in the charts. But she kept going. Her methods grew more confident, more clever. She began switching labels, replacing furosemide with potassium chloride, confusing the techs into administering silent cardiac arrests. One patient received 4 times the anticoagulant dose. Another was denied their dialysis slot because the form was missing. Evelyn never left fingerprints. She left explanations. And when suspicions finally rose, after a 3rd patient died under her watch in a single month, she had charts to show her actions were approved, that the deaths were expected declines. It took the curiosity of a first-year resident to undo her. He noticed an odd pattern. Every one of Evelyn's patients had DNRs signed within days of admission, but many were forged. Investigators found that Evelyn would wait for moments of drowsiness, record shaky signatures from the hands of the confused or sedated, and staple them quietly into the files. Some weren't even signed by the patients at all, just elderly scrawls copied from old wristbands. The more they looked, the deeper it went. 18 suspected deaths, 12 were ruled officially suspicious. But Evelyn wasn't arrested immediately. She was placed on administrative leave. That's when she panicked. She went to the home of a former co-worker and begged for help destroying old files, offering to split an envelope of cash she kept hidden under her freezer. The co-worker refused and reported her. When police searched Evelyn's apartment, they found the envelope, but also something far stranger. Dozens of handwritten notes, folded tightly and stacked in a shoebox. Each began with a date and a name, followed by a letter to the deceased. You looked peaceful when I turned the machine off. I whispered your favorite hymn before I did it. Or, "They said you wouldn't last the week. I made sure you didn't suffer the wait." They were confessions, but dressed as affection. She didn't see herself as a killer. She saw herself as a comfort, a necessary shadow in a place full of slow goodbyes. She never admitted guilt. During trial, her expression never changed, not even when the son of one of her victims cried reading his mother's forged DNR. She just stared at him, then turned to the court reporter to ask for the spelling of a word he'd used. The judge called her demeanor chillingly administrative. Evelyn was sentenced to life without parole. She's now housed in a medical unit of a state correctional facility, ironically, still surrounded by the very kind of people she once believed needed help leaving. But even behind bars, her story remains a template for the perfect inside job. No gun, no chase, just paperwork, patience, and an angel's smile. And yet, even Evelyn Mercer's methodical cruelty would pale compared to the orderly who followed her. He didn't fake paperwork. He didn't whisper hymns. He used silence differently, not to soothe, but to stalk. Evelyn Mercer wasn't the first to use hospital silence as a weapon, and she wouldn't be the last. Because while her crimes stirred panic in one wing of the city, something far older, far quieter had been unfolding across town. At St. Adelphi's Memorial, an underfunded, overworked county hospital known for peeling ceilings and underpaid staff, death didn't scream. It whispered, and it came not from syringes or sedatives, but from the slow, creeping presence of a man no one ever suspected. His name was Martin Bell. He wasn't a nurse or a surgeon, or even someone who wore scrubs. Martin was the janitor, 57 years old, thinning hair slicked back with cheap gel and a body bent more by habit than age. He moved through the halls in silence, always early, always alone. Staff described him as harmless, polite, invisible. He never made eye contact, never joined breakroom chatter, but he noticed everything. He kept a spiral notebook tucked inside his supply cart. Not an official log, but a private record. Room numbers, oxygen readings, cleaning routes. Some pages had little circles drawn next to them. Some had names that didn't appear on any discharge sheet. What nobody realized, until it was too late, was that Martin had been watching patterns for years. Patterns of neglect, of abandonment, of who was visited and who wasn't, and most importantly, who wouldn't be missed. The deaths started small. A hospice patient with late-stage ALS, a dementia case who pulled her IV. Each one logged as natural causes until an intern noticed something strange in an old chart. A patient had coded after a routine bed linen change, even though vitals had been stable minutes before. Her room had been marked sanitized by Martin Bell. Coincidence, they thought, until it happened again and again. Each time, the patient was elderly, sedated, and alone. Each time, Martin had been the last non-medical staff assigned to the room. He never left a mess, never triggered a call light. But there were other signs. Pillowcases missing from inventory, abnormal pressure readings in oxygen tanks, and a strange floral scent reported in multiple rooms on the nights patients died. The scent matched the detergent Martin used, a discontinued brand he brought from home. Nurses began to grow uneasy. One CNA claimed she walked past room 418 and saw Martin just standing there, hands folded, staring at the patient through the glass. When she returned 10 minutes later, the bed was flat, monitors silenced, and the door was locked from the inside. She reported it. Admin dismissed it. The patient was cremated before an autopsy could be ordered. That's when Dr. Gilman, a skeptical ER supervisor, decided to run a quiet review. He traced 12 deaths over 15 months, all under Martin's shift, all without escalation. When security footage was finally reviewed, something chilling emerged. In several cases, Martin entered rooms carrying a sealed plastic bag. He exited without it. Those bags were never logged, never found. During a night sweep of the janitor's storage closet, police uncovered a false panel behind the shelving. Inside were 6 vacuum-sealed pouches, each containing modified nasal cannulas with narrowed airflow valves, a bottle of rose-scented detergent, and pages torn from a spiral notebook. The writing was clinical, cold. One entry read, "She blinked twice. I waited. There was peace." Martin was arrested the next morning without resistance. He told officers, "Hospitals forget people. I don't." He never confessed to murder, but when detectives asked why he altered oxygen lines, he responded, "Some things are better fated than forced." No direct evidence tied him to the deaths, no fingerprints on the equipment, no surveillance inside the rooms. But the journals, the equipment modifications, and the statistical anomalies were damning. The DA charged him with reckless endangerment and tampering with medical supplies. During trial, a forensic pathologist testified that the oxygen tubes could have induced hypoxic death without visible trauma, the perfect silent kill. The jury was split. Some believed he was just a disturbed man with a savior complex. Others called him a serial killer hiding behind cleaning gloves. In the end, Martin was sentenced to 45 years for medical sabotage, but investigators still believe the true count of his victims could be higher than 30. When asked if he regretted anything, he simply said, "I cleaned what others left dirty." And in the corner of his journal's final page, barely visible beneath the smeared ink, were 5 more names, none of which matched any known patient record. Staff at St. Adelphi's say his old cart still sits in the storage basement, untouched. Some refuse to go near it, because every so often when the lights flicker near the oxygen tanks, someone swears they smell roses. Martin Bell didn't see death as punishment. He saw it as maintenance. That's what separated him from the usual chaos that investigators expected in serial murders. There were no bursts of emotion, no broken cameras or bloody rages or revenge notes. Instead, every action Martin took appeared to follow a quiet, methodical framework, as if he was performing a long, slow audit of the forgotten. The hospital's internal investigation found that Martin had requested room assignments based on floor plans, not patient need. Janitorial staff were allowed to rotate floors, but Martin never did. He insisted on staying in the hospice wing, claiming the equipment was easier to clean and the rooms were less chaotic. But records showed he had altered his schedule on at least 27 occasions, requesting late-night shifts in rooms where patients were due for palliative sedatives. He logged fake spills to justify additional time alone. He swapped out linen carts for ones with false compartments. And most notably, he avoided rooms with family visitors or working oxygen monitors. The forensic reconstruction showed that Martin's method hinged on subtle disruption. He didn't cut lines or inject poisons. He pinched tubing just enough to reduce airflow below survivable levels over time. Hypoxia set in slowly, mimicking a peaceful death. Most patients already had DNRs. Nurses assumed they had passed naturally in their sleep, but one nurse later testified that she noticed something strange. The patients Martin cleaned for often had a faint residue on their upper lips, almost like lotion. No one thought much of it. But lab tests revealed that residue matched trace elements found in his detergent, one designed to mask organic odors. That's when investigators realized he wasn't just suffocating patients. He was preparing them, cleaning them, wiping their faces before anyone found them, treating the death like a closing shift. Even more disturbing were his journals. Each entry read like a status report. There was no poetry, no apology, just timestamps, names, notes about breathing patterns, and one recurring phrase, "Ready by morning." When the media got hold of excerpts, public reaction was divided. Some saw Martin as a reaper of mercy. Others saw him as a sadist disguised as a janitor. but the forensic evidence kept piling up. One entry described a patient who stared for 27 seconds before pupil dilation. Another outlined a process Martin called soft hold, where he'd place a warm towel over a patient's mouth after reducing oxygen to speed unconsciousness. Experts determined this could mimic palliative sedation, but if timed incorrectly, would result in asphyxia. Multiple exhumations were requested, but most bodies had already been cremated. Still, investigators managed to retrieve tissue samples from 5 embalmed corpses. 3 showed signs of oxygen deprivation inconsistent with documented causes of death. In legal terms, it wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough to show intent. A behavioral analyst reviewed Martin's writings and concluded that he exhibited a rare blend of institutional loyalty and moral detachment. He believed he was restoring dignity, not taking life. But there was one section in his notes that broke from the pattern. A sequence of numbered initials and sketches, including hospital blueprints and corridor maps. It became clear that Martin had cataloged every access point, every supply closet, every blind spot. He even noted where certain cameras had blind angles. This wasn't mercy, it was control. Prosecutors argued that he'd created a private system, a mental grid of opportunity zones, and in every one of them, someone quietly disappeared. During his trial, Martin remained composed. When presented with images of the victims, he didn't flinch. When asked about his journals, he described them as routine metrics, and when asked directly if he had killed anyone, he simply said, "I maintained peace." His defense team leaned into the mental health angle, citing his lack of family, his obsession with order, and possible schizoid traits. But the prosecution countered with motive by isolation, that Martin had no one and had turned to control as his only companionship. In a particularly chilling moment, they read aloud one of his final entries. "They sleep better when they're clean. No more noise, no more machines. Just still." The jury deliberated for 6 days. In the end, he was convicted not of homicide, but of felony tampering with life-sustaining equipment and criminal negligence resulting in death. He was sentenced to 45 years in a maximum security prison with no eligibility for parole until age 98. But even in confinement, Martin maintained his routine. Guards reported that he cleaned his cell every morning at 5 a.m., folded towels into precise squares, and stared at the fluorescent light until breakfast. He never spoke to other inmates, never wrote letters, just watched. When prison psychologists tried to assess remorse, he gave only one sentence: "Hospitals don't kill people, they just don't stop it." And perhaps that was his ultimate delusion, that in a place where death was common, adding a few more names to the list wasn't murder, it was efficiency. Even now, St. Adelphi's refuses to comment publicly about his case, but the staff remember. The hospice wing has since been remodeled, cameras upgraded, and janitorial shifts doubled. Yet still, when a patient dies unexpectedly and no one can quite explain how, some nurses whisper that it's just Martin's legacy, still scrubbing, still watching, still choosing quiet over cure. Some killers operate in the silence of basements or the shadows of utility closets, but others thrive in the open, hiding behind smiles, stethoscopes, and the illusion of compassion. After the chilling arrest of Martin Bell sent waves through the corridors of St. Adelphi's Memorial, hospitals across the country quietly began internal audits, terrified of what similar shadows might be hiding in plain sight. And in Michigan's Lakeview Community Medical Center, they didn't find a janitor, they found a physician. Dr. Lorraine Miles was known among colleagues as meticulous, gentle, and unnervingly calm in crisis. She specialized in critical care and had worked night shifts for nearly 11 years. The staff called her the Midnight Guardian, half out of respect, half because she rarely left the hospital grounds. But behind her reputation was a disturbing pattern that wouldn't unravel until a resident noticed something peculiar. During Lorraine's shifts, terminal patients in the ICU coded at nearly 3 times the rate of any other doctor's rotation. Most of these deaths were written off as inevitable. DNRs were signed. Comorbidities masked the trends. But one case, a young trauma victim who was stable upon admission, triggered suspicion when he went into sudden cardiac arrest just hours after Lorraine's intervention. A post-mortem revealed traces of potassium chloride, a compound that, when injected in high doses, stops the heart in seconds and becomes nearly undetectable within hours. Lorraine had noted no such administration in the chart, nor had she recorded anything abnormal in her shift logs. That silence started a quiet probe. Hospital administrators cross-referenced medication logs, patient vitals, and surveillance footage, discovering multiple gaps during Lorraine's overnight rounds. The ICU cameras, while present, didn't cover individual rooms, but hallway footage revealed Lorraine entering several critical rooms minutes before unexpected code blues. At first, it seemed coincidental. Doctors check vitals. They respond to alarms. But Lorraine wasn't responding. She was initiating. Investigators soon discovered a shocking detail. Lorraine had bypass access to the hospital's central medication dispensary, even when pharmacy protocol dictated dual authorization. When pressed, she claimed it was a glitch in her login credentials. But IT records showed she had manually overridden 14 safety warnings in less than a month. Each override preceded a death. And every death was someone either terminal, heavily sedated, or alone. There were no family complaints, no foul play suspected, just quiet losses, quiet paperwork, quiet vanishing. But one nurse, a new transfer from out of state, took photos of Lorraine's patient notes after finding them oddly vague. Phrases like, "let them rest," or "free now," were scrawled in the margins beside vital signs. She turned the notes over to the risk management team, who brought in state medical board officials. Lorraine was placed under observation, not arrested, but during those 2 weeks, no patients died under her care. That silence was louder than evidence. When confronted, she denied everything. She called it a smear campaign against a woman in power. But the audit trail said otherwise. Blood samples were retested. Of 19 deaths under review, 11 showed biochemical anomalies consistent with potassium toxicity. The cause of death had never been flagged because the victims were already ill, already dying, already fading. But Lorraine had helped them cross that final line, whether they wanted to or not. When police finally searched her apartment, they found notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting. But it wasn't a confession. It was poetry. Dozens of verses about peace, silence, and the stillness of breath. In one, she wrote, "I do not kill. I deliver. I do not take. I release. I do not harm. I quiet the noise." Prosecutors used those lines in court. The media called her the Angel of Silence. But in truth, Dr. Lorraine Miles was no angel. She was a gatekeeper, deciding who got to live out their pain and who didn't. Not because they asked her to, but because she believed they shouldn't have to ask at all. What made Dr. Lorraine Miles so terrifying wasn't the fact that she killed, it was how utterly convinced she was that she was helping. In her mind, the hospital wasn't a place of healing. It was a corridor of endings, a sterile hallway of prolonged suffering dressed up as care. When authorities dug deeper into her background, they found no red flags, no history of violence, no disciplinary reports in her medical file, and no complaints from patients or their families. She'd even received 2 commendations from the board for handling emotional end-of-life cases with grace. But the truth buried beneath her accolades painted a chilling portrait of a woman who didn't just accept death, she orchestrated it. Her apartment was clean, orderly, and cold. Every room had white walls, white curtains, and an uncanny silence, as if no one had ever spoken there. Investigators noted how even her personal books, all medical and philosophical, were stacked by date of publication, not topic. It was all designed for control. She didn't want to learn, she wanted to master. Her journals, the ones filled with poetry, were interspersed with what the FBI's behavioral unit would later call spiritual justifications for ethical desecration. She saw herself as a bridge between pain and peace, and believed her hands were extensions of something higher, a divine quiet. But the details of her actions told a much darker story. Lorraine never used the same dose twice. She altered her methods subtly, sometimes a potassium injection, sometimes a lethal mix of insulin and sedative. She selected her victims based on one shared trait: emotional isolation. If they had no visitors in 72 hours, they became eligible in her mind. If their families were estranged or hadn't returned calls, even better. To her, that meant they were untethered. The term appeared in her notebooks 67 times. "Untethered patients drift," she wrote. "I simply stopped the drift." Surveillance showed her sitting by some of these patients' bedsides, speaking to them, stroking their hands, then slipping out just minutes before alarms blared. One nurse recalled walking past room 408 and seeing Lorraine humming softly, eyes closed, as she held a man's hand. The patient was unresponsive, hooked to a ventilator, and scheduled for transfer the next morning. He never made it. The autopsy noted respiratory failure, unremarkable given his condition, but a review of his medication showed a double dose of morphine no one had signed for. Lorraine had a way of moving through protocols like they were suggestions, not rules. She'd spent years learning how to document just enough, how to chart in a way that looked clean but left no trail, how to cover her own fingerprints with sterile gloves of plausible deniability. But it was the silence between her actions that finally betrayed her. No one dies perfectly, not even when it's planned. And when an entire hospital starts noticing that one doctor's patients seem to go quietly, someone eventually asks why. At trial, Lorraine sat with a composed face, unmoved by testimonies, photos, or the tears of grieving families. When her defense team argued she had compassion fatigue and believed she was ending suffering, she didn't correct them. But when the prosecution labeled her a murderer, her left eye twitched, not from guilt, but from insult. She didn't believe she was evil. She believed she was elevated. In a closing statement, the district attorney read one of her entries aloud. "When the breath stutters, I complete it. When the body begs to stop, I let it. When the pain is all that's left, I remove it. I do not take lives. I complete them." The courtroom fell into a cold silence, not because of horror, but because of how calm it all sounded. Lorraine was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She never spoke during sentencing, and when asked if she had anything to say to the families of her victims, she simply shook her head once, then smiled faintly, like she still believed she'd done them a favor. To this day, hospital administrators never released the full list of suspected victims, but one internal memo later leaked to a medical journal estimated the count at over 35. 35 patients who didn't ask to die, who didn't choose to be untethered, but who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a doctor who decided she could do God's job better than anyone else. Lorraine Miles wasn't just another hospital killer. She was a high priestess of false mercy, cloaked in a white coat, hiding a graveyard beneath her silence. But even in the shadow Lorraine Miles left behind, there was still one more presence lurking the corridors. Not a doctor, not a nurse, but someone who knew the layout better than either. Orderlies aren't often noticed. They push wheelchairs, mop hallways, change linens, and transport bodies when no one else wants to. And that anonymity, that quiet access to every room, every chart, every shift rotation, is exactly what Mason Greer relied on. If the others operated like surgeons of death, he worked more like a janitor of vengeance, sweeping his motives under layers of routine. Greer had been hired in 1993 by Redfield Memorial, a long-term care hospital tucked on the edge of the city. He'd passed his background checks cleanly, had no priors, and showed up every day for 7 years without a single sick day. His file described him as reliable, punctual, a little quiet, but always polite. But what no one ever noticed was that Mason never parked in the staff lot. He took the bus, not out of thrift, but because he didn't want his car traced. He never spoke about his past, avoided group events, and often volunteered for night shifts in the terminal wing. Over time, nurses began joking that he saw more death than the coroner. But for Mason, that was the point. His victims weren't chosen at random, nor were they all terminal. Instead, they shared one thing. Each had a relative who worked at the hospital, a niece on the pediatric floor, a brother in accounting, a cousin in imaging. And Mason? He kept a list, not of the patients, but of the staff. Because Mason didn't believe in killing for satisfaction. He killed for equilibrium. 2 years before his hiring, his mother had died in a hospital very much like Redfield. Not from disease, but from what Mason called neglect under a badge. The nurse responsible had clocked out, left her post, and no one noticed until hours later. His mother died alone, in pain, with her IV alarm blinking silently. The nurse kept her license, Mason kept the memory, and now he had a plan. Each victim was a message, a puzzle piece in a campaign of quiet retaliation. He'd never touch the staff member. He'd touch someone they loved, and do it so carefully that no one suspected foul play. Until, of course, the staff began noticing the pattern. Until whispers of, "Wasn't that Dr. Sim's uncle?" or "That's weird, another tech's relative in 3B just passed," became unavoidable. But by then, Mason was already 5 names deep into his list, and no one had even looked at him twice. Mason's method was simplicity in disguise. He didn't inject, smother, or stab. He adjusted temperatures, oxygen lines, medication labels. He'd swap saline with distilled water, lower morphine drips until the patient clawed for relief. Or, most often, he'd invert the bed sensors so the alarms never triggered when vitals flatlined. His favorite tool was a small pair of surgical scissors, not for violence, but for snipping identification tags and rewiring medical equipment. Everything he did looked like a malfunction, a miscommunication, or a slow decline that had already begun. Each patient died in their sleep or during an off shift. None were autopsied. Not until a young nurse named Carla Mendez noticed a single repeated anomaly. Each deceased patient had logged an oxygen disconnection at exactly 3:03 a.m., even when they weren't on oxygen. She brought it to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a system error. But Carla dug deeper. She checked cross-shift logs, rotation patterns, and eventually discovered the only staff member present every time was Mason. When hospital administrators confronted him, he didn't argue. He smiled, not in arrogance, but as if relieved. "I thought I'd have to reach 10, he said. "7's cleaner." Investigators found a notebook in his locker. It listed staff names on the left, their relation on the right, and a final column labeled "Silence Achieved." Each entry was dated, initialed, and coded with medical acronyms. On his apartment wall, detectives found photographs, not of victims, but of hospital wings, staff break rooms, and hand-drawn maps detailing which corridors had broken security cameras. He'd never filmed a thing, never confessed in writing, but he had recorded audio, tapes of his mother's final voicemails. He played them on loop while he cleaned the bodies, repeating under his breath, "They left her blinking." When asked in court why he didn't kill the nurse responsible directly, Mason said, "Because she wasn't alone that night. They all were. Every one of them failed to see her." It was the only time he cried during the entire trial. The jury deliberated for under 2 hours. Mason was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. And when a journalist asked if he regretted anything, Mason replied, "Just that the hospital never apologized. That was all I wanted. An apology." In the end, Mason Greer didn't view himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a correction, a necessary recalibration of compassion in a place that had forgotten what care really meant. And while his name faded into true crime databases, Redfield Memorial quietly overhauled its entire staff protocol, but never released a statement. Because what haunted them most wasn't what Mason did. It was how long he got away with it, simply by holding a mop, walking with purpose, and always smiling when no one else wanted to work the night shift. They walked the halls in scrubs, not shadows, smiled while resetting monitors, charted deaths that looked like mercy. But these 5 didn't heal, they hunted. Each wore trust like a mask, and each used routine as their camouflage. Because in a hospital, the silence of death rarely raises alarms, and that's exactly how they got away with it, until they didn't.